Hello and welcome to another edition of Conservative Corner. I'm your host, Tom Mountain. We are a cable access TV show based here in Newton, Massachusetts at the studios of New TV. And basically what we talk about on our show are issues that necessarily wouldn't get covered by, shall we say, the liberal mainstream media, both in print and on the internet and certainly on TV. So essentially what we do is we talk about the issues of the day, and we talk about them from, say, a conservative Republican perspective and add our perspective to the many perspectives that are out there from the liberal side. Sometimes when issues come up, or rather when important days or events come up, we will divert to those, and we will talk about things that aren't necessarily controversial or aren't necessarily, and some people would say, divisive. They may be from a more humanitarian or historical perspective. So for those of you looking for controversy tonight, or today on this show, I don't think that you're going to find it. But nevertheless, we promise you this will be an interesting, packed half an hour, and the half hour goes very fast. And today, from where we're taping, is Holocaust Remembrance Day. It is Yom HaShoah in Israel. And what that means is that we are commemorating those millions of Jews and millions of others in Europe who were killed during the Holocaust. What happens in Israel, there is a siren that goes off, and everybody stops what they're doing. They come out of their stores, they come out of their cars right on the highway, and they stand in silence for 1 minute to commemorate those 6 million Jews who were killed in the Holocaust. And it's a very solemn time and a very solemn moment. And that's what this day commemorates. It's a yearly event. And I participated in it really since I was a student at Brandeis, and having lived in Israel, I've experienced it firsthand. And I'm very glad tonight to have with us a gentleman who is the president of the Italian-American Alliance in America. And his name is Dr. Dom Amara, and he's from East Boston. And you probably want to inquire or are wondering, why are we having the president of the Italian-American Alliance if I just mentioned that this is Holocaust Remembrance Day, and we're going to focus to a point on the Holocaust? Well, because Dr. Dom, if I may call him that, wrote an excellent essay pertaining to Italy and the Holocaust, and it's received rave reviews. It's going around the internet, it's going around the country. And I'd like for him to elaborate on some of the themes. And the title of it is The Italian Holocaust, the Tragic, the Heroic, the Overlooked, and the Lessons. And I want to first ask you, Doctor, what prompted you to write this essay? And could you give us a synopsis of what it's all about?
Well, I knew you were going to ask the question. So I thought I would quote something, if I may. There's a quote that's attributed to Edmund Burke that said the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing.
That's right.
That actually is it was a driving force for me to write this. But incidentally, I mean, actually, the statement was really drawn from another philosopher called John Stuart Mill. And I'll read it because I can never remember it. It's so long.
And I believe Edmund Burke was a British parliamentarian in the 18th century.
Yes.
And John Stuart Mill, I believe, was in the 17th century or maybe early 18th century, also from England.
He was a utilitarian philosopher.
Yes, also from Britain.
And he said, let not any one, let me put my glasses on, I'm sorry. Let not any one pacify his conscience by the delusion that he can do no harm if he takes no part and forms no opinion. Bad men need nothing more to compass their ends than that good men should look on and do nothing. He is not a good man who, without a protest, allows wrong to be committed in his name, and with the means by which he is to help to supply, because he will not trouble himself to use his mind on the subject. and I think even though I'm thoroughly Italian, as Italian as you can
You're an
get.
Italian Catholic, of
Catholic,
course, from
Italian
East
Catholic,
Boston.
From East Boston.
Yes, indeed.
My parents were from Sicily, and I had a very strong upbringing with lots of Jewish stories. If I may explain one of them. My father was a cobbler. He was when he came to this country. There's true stories now. He came to this country, he worked in a foundry, could not make any money. This was a very tough time for Italians who came to this country. Most people don't realize that of all the Italians that came to this country, literally half of them went back because they could not make it here.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it was an unwelcoming place. It was not place that they could survive, and literally half of them went back. Anyway, my father was one of those that was struggling. He was a young man, and he said, "I think I'll be a shoemaker, a cobbler." He had some training in the old country. So he was looking for a place, and he didn't have any money, and no one would offer him a place where he could work. He met this fellow who his name was George Davis. George Davis was an attorney who was a big, powerful, wealthy attorney in downtown Boston. He went to my father went to his and he said, "I'm renting the place," and he says, "Like, but I can't pay you right now. Can I pay you later?" So Mr. Davis said, "Yes." He says, "You pay me when you can." So my father, in the cellar of this building, started a shoe shop, and he was successful. He was a good shoe repairman, had a good business, made a good living, made a good family, provided for his family, helped us go to college, and every Saturday I used to work with him in his shoe shop. I was a very good cobbler, by the way. I think I was in his shop until I was in my late 30s. And anyway, one day I was there, and this fellow came down. He started to rail against Jews. I have forgotten what he said, but he was railing against them. My father took it for a while, and then he took his hammer, and he, very gentle man, but he raised his hammer and says, "You get out of here. You leave my shop." He said, "It was the Jews who helped me get my place."
Oh.
And the man left. And Mr. Davis became a very close friend of the family. He used to come to our home, and this man was a very wealthy man. Didn't have to have any relationship at all with a cobbler or a son, etc. And my father was so grateful that he wanted him to be my godfather. He couldn't because he was Jewish and the church required him to be Catholic. So he said, "I'll do one better." He says, "I'm going to name my son George. His middle name is George, after George Davis."
Wow.
So
Isn't that
my middle
wonderful?
name is George, based upon this Jewish attorney who helped my parents just to get a start. And he came to our house several times. And when I left the university and said to him I was going to medical school, and he says, "Yeah, what do you want to do that for?" He said, "Why don't you become a salesman?" He says, "I can make you more money." He tried to get me a job as a salesman in a surgical supply company, which would have brought in lots of money. I didn't do that. And the rest is history.
Wow. That's a wonderful story.
But it was so there's a real connection, and it's a living connection. And that's not the basis of something like this, but it certainly is a bit of historical
But it's an excellent
relevance.
essay. Could you give us some highlights from it?
Well, the reason I wrote it was because of what I just read, that if someone doesn't say something. Now, the Italian Holocaust, very few people even know there was such a thing as an Italian Holocaust. people realized there was a Jewish Holocaust, I mean, there was a Nazi Holocaust, a German Holocaust, but very few people knew that there was an Italian Holocaust. An Italian Holocaust was different. It certainly wasn't as deep, but the same things happened to Jews there that happened in Germany, and it just wasn't at the same volume, and there were some extenuations. And I've been criticized as saying, why did you even bring it up? You know, it's sort of like the narrative is that, you know, it's a bygone thing. Very few people even know about it, et cetera, et cetera. I says, well, that's the whole idea. Unless people speak about it, we don't know what our errors were, where it came, and how we can prevent it. Because part of this is, how do we stop it from happening? And we can take the lessons from the Holocaust, both the German and the Italian Holocaust, and see the parallels that are happening today.
But, you know, it's fascinating that you're focusing on this and that you wrote about this. But one of the interesting realities of World War II and the Holocaust and this was told to me by my professor at Brandeis, Leon Jick, who was an expert at on the Holocaust in the 1980s. He was from Newton. And he reiterated that if you were a Jew living in a democracy at the outset of World War II, your chances of survival through World War II were much less than if you were a Jew living in a fascist country. For example, in Holland, in very democratic Holland, at the beginning of World War II, 73% of the Jews were killed by the end of the war. In ultra-democratic Czechoslovakia, the same scenario. About 75% of the Jews were killed in Czechoslovakia by the end of the war. In France, very liberal Democrat France, the French authorities rounded up the Jews before the German Nazis even asked for them. In other words, they started rounding them up in 1941, and the Germans weren't ready to take them east to Poland. So they had to keep them in the camps in and around Paris before the Germans were ready to ship them out based on their train capacity. However, with the Italians, it was a very different story. Italy was run by the fascists, Mussolini. Now, midway during the war, the Italians overthrew Mussolini in September 1943, and then switched sides and sided with the Allies, with the Americans and the British. And however, the Germans quickly came down across the Alps and occupied half of Italy. And they managed to reinstate Mussolini in power with a really de facto fascist government in northern Italy. And in southern Italy, of course, it was run by the Free Italian government and supported by the Americans. And there was a big military campaign to oust the Germans, which really didn't succeed very well until the Germans surrendered at the end of the war. Nevertheless, the country was split in half. Yet, even during the time, through early 1943, the Germans would pressure Mussolini to give up the Jews, and he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. And even after Mussolini became a puppet of Germany in northern Italy, they still were reluctant to do it. They wouldn't do it. In fact, there was a time, and it was early 1943, it was actually demonstrated, it was actually recorded that Italian soldiers were known to have fired upon Germans who came for the Jews. So, at the end of the war, about 84% of Italian Jews survived the war, which is an extraordinary number. Not only that, but in southern Europe, in the Mediterranean periphery, and as we get into Albania and Greece, etc., the Italian fascist army occupied those areas on behalf of the Germans. Now, in Greece, Greece was taken over by the Germans. Greece was taken over by the Germans as well. But the Italians, while they were occupying it, did not give up the Jews to the Germans. However, when the Italians themselves, if the audience is following me on this, when the Italians themselves, when they switched sides, when they were then taken into custody and imprisoned by the Germans for switching sides to the Americans and the British, then the Germans took over all of Greece, and then up to 90% of the Greek Jews were killed. So the point is that in Italy, Italy was one of the few countries that had a remarkable record in saving the vast majority of its Jews. I think the only country which surpasses that is Denmark, because in Denmark they were able to send their Jews across the waterways into Sweden, which was located just at least a dozen miles from them. But nevertheless, it's really a testament to the Italian government, the Italian people, and I think really the Italian spirit, that most of the Jews survived. Now, if you look at the worst country, of course, was Poland. Poland, you had it was horrendous, over 3 million Jews, and in 1939, by 1946-47, there were less than 10,000. Now, granted, many of the Jews after that went to Israel, but the death rate of the Jews was 95%. But Italy was really an exception to the rule. And so I think that this is a part of history which people don't know and don't realize and should realize. And so where you came and so graciously alerted people to this and just, told the community in general, and have received, rightfully so, accolades for doing so, I commend you for it. And you've told a lot of stories about Italians, individual Italians who are being honored in Israel with trees and monuments planted on their behalf. But again, I think that it really gets down to the psyche of the country that you're in. There was a will on behalf of the Italians to save the Jews, and whereas in Poland there wasn't. And even in northern Italy, when the Italian fascist government still controlled it, right to the end of the war, I mean, you had centers where there were a lot of Jews, like Milan, Verona, and Venice. They were hidden, they were brought to the countryside, and the Italian people wouldn't give them up. And that's the extraordinary thing about it. When you have a Nazi ally, which was fascist Italy, and the vast majority of the Jews survived. And it was a different situation in, for example, Hungary. In Hungary, they didn't give up the Jews until the very end, when Germany itself occupied the country of Hungary, and they found a government, an ultra-fascist government, willing to give up the Jews. But the same thing really happened in Italy, where you also had an ultra-fascist government, which refused to give up the Jews. That's the difference. That's really the major difference. And again, we're talking about this because this is Holocaust Remembrance Day, and obviously by the time that this show is shown in the networks or in the coming weeks and if not month, then this will be, shall we say, history. But nevertheless, and we're bringing this to the present, and you so graciously came on because you're obviously disturbed, and very much so, at what we see here, which is the kidnapping of so many Jews, and what was really an assault on the Jewish nation, on Jews in general, on October 7th of last year, something that we haven't seen really since World War II, since the Holocaust itself, where basically the Hamas, I call them Nazi terrorists, captured Jews and Jewish babies, put them in ovens, burned them alive, killed children in front of their parents, killed parents in front of their children, and viciously raped and mutilated women, Jewish women, and took them and dragged them through the streets of Gaza. And you obviously saw this as well. And I think that, and you wrote this, you mentioned or you've elaborated on before, that having witnessed that and having seen this, that you're equally disturbed at that as well.
I think what's one of the things, I think anybody who saw that and was honest with themselves couldn't feel anything else. And I think you could, if you look at the data, look at the results of the polls, that the country was so appalled when they heard of this. The tenor of the country has changed. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the questions is we have to ask why. And I think the answers lie in many answers lie in what caused it in the first place in places like Germany and Italy. And there are some parallels. And starting with the universities and with the media and with government bureaucracy and just plain greed. I mean, just economic greed.
Are you surprised? So what you're saying is what you're seeing today at schools like UCLA, Columbia, and even MIT and Harvard.
It's exactly
There
what happened. Exactly what happened.
parallels to Nazi Germany.
The parallels are there.
Well, that's a disturbing thing because it's, people assume, or at least the liberals assumed in America, that the anti-Semitism came from the working class high school dropouts somewhere in the Midwest. And what we're actually seeing is from the intelligentsia, and not just any colleges, but the aforementioned centers of academic excellence, supposedly, the UCLAs and the Harvards and MITs of the world, and Columbias.
But you have to remember that the same things happened in Europe, and how it was in many cases staged. Universities were one of the. I'm going to pick on the universities for a minute. Universities were one of those areas in which they, in order to prepare, and I'm speaking now of the Italian Holocaust particularly, in order to prepare people for the anti-Semitism laws that went in by Mussolini. Mussolini was always anti-Semitic. He never really came out and said that. His early writings were always anonymous but anti-Semitic. It wasn't until later that he started to push anti-Semitism, but the anti-Semitism was done through the bureaucracy, and then through through legislation. And then when the laws came out, before the laws came out, there was a hiatus between this preparation and the laws. And part of the preparation was to get the universities basically it became propaganda units, which is what's happening here. And as an example of that, the way they prepared, the way the Nazi prepared, and the way the Italians prepared the people for these new laws, these anti-Jewish laws that were coming about, because these were very democratic states, and they lived in relative calm with the population. I mean, these were fairly liberal democratic states. So they had to prepare these people. How come we're starting to come down hard on the Jews? Well, the Germans did it by saying, well, they said, look at the science, which is very similar to what we're doing now. Look at the studies of evolution. Look at the studies in eugenics. Look at the studies in anthropology. Look at they would start to look at all of these different scientific approaches, which is really Western based. And they said, on this basis, the Jews are less than the rest of them, the rest of us. And they did that in Italy. So when the Jewish law, when the fascist laws against Italy came out, the Italian people were ready for this. Now, some went along with it for a whole bunch of reasons, and some of them were economic. Most of them, the Italians as a race, as a group, pretty laissez-faire. Someone has to punch me in the nose before I'm going to punch you back. They're not going to buy the pablum that people hand to them unless there's a real reason. And I think that's what happens. That's what happened in Italy.
But the important distinction with Italy is that despite all these anti-Semitic edicts by the government, and despite the fact that the government tried to coerce or convince the public to go along with them, the public may have to a point. But the main difference is that in Italy they didn't kill the Jews. Right. To a point they did. The 14% of the Jews in Italy were killed, disappeared, but the overwhelming majority did not. And also in Italy, there were no death camps, and I don't even think that there were really any official concentration camps. There may have been deportation camps, maybe, I'm not sure.
There was when Mussolini was, when he really started to come out with his edicts, he did create forced labor, but the forced labor was not necessarily in camps.
Yes.
When he was in power alone in the northern part of Italy after the king said
September 1943.
1943 kicked him
Yeah.
out. Then he started to plan this idea of work camps, which were he was planning the idea of work camps. However, the military really had wanted nothing to do with this. The Italian military almost had nothing to do with this. For the most part, the people wanted nothing to do with this. Although there were some that went along with it. There were bureaucrats that went along with it, and there were bureaucrats that said, "We're not going to bother with this," and actually helped the Jews with passports and et cetera, et cetera. So this was a mixed bag. That this was, like, as I said in the thing, this was a great horror and at a time of great courage. You know, there were Italians who had great courage. When I talk about individuals who hid Jews in their bakeries for days and days on end when the Jews were looking for them. There were people who hid them in their homes, in their cellars, and whatever. At any one time, if they were turned in, and this was a time when there were a lot of Italian spies and there were a lot of German spies around. So they really did take their life and
I think also it should be noted that one of the tragedies of the war in Italy, was that the Americans and the British, the Allies, really did not defeat the Germans in Italy. The German army surrendered at the end of the war. And so what that meant was the war really continued, and the occupation by the Germans continued right to the end. Yet, and so one would think that, the Jews, the Nazis were obsessed with killing every Jew that they could find. And even though that they knew that they were being defeated, in their retreat, they killed them. They kept killing them. But again, that didn't happen in Italy. And that's the most amazing thing. And in cities like in Turin and Milan, the Jews were spared. And so by the end of the war, that the Jews really survived. There was a wonderful movie, and it's called Life is Beautiful.
I saw that.
And I believe that it's in Italian, and it really tells the story about what happened to an extent with the Jews in Italy. So, yes, there was a Holocaust in Italy, but keeping it in perspective of the general Holocaust that was in Europe during the time, it was not insignificant, but it was really minimal, and that's in large part due to the Italian people and the spirit of the Italian people that refused to participate in it. Doctor,
that's true.
We're being told to wrap up,
okay.
And this goes very fast. It's the fastest 30 minutes on cable TV. We could spend 2 hours, and I wish we could.
On this.
I wish we could, but I thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And I want to have you back at some point.
Yes.